When all is said and done, is Einstein a modern? Well, Einstein draws on modern movements of philosophy, of Mach's sense-based positivism, of Poincaré's endorsement of conventionalism, this idea that we choose our rules to be most convenient for our human use. Einstein becomes a resource for logical positivists and artists alike. The Dadaists embrace his work. Hannah Höch embraces it to construct her icons of photomontage, advanced work in the artistic world. The Surrealists take it up, including Duchamp. Some used Einstein as a sign of a revolutionary break. Others engaged his idea of space-time and relativity. Einstein stood for a way of challenging aspects of our world that hadn't been put to the test. In other ways, Einstein is a classicist. His theories are determinist, completely independent of the observer. In many ways, Einstein is the ultimate classicist, removing ever more dependence on perspective, saying that what's real are these space-time intervals that don't depend on the observer, or saying that the laws of physics are given once and every observer in an inertial reference frame sees them as a single set of laws in special relativity, and all observers in all frames observe these laws the same way in the general theory of relativity. Einstein's classicism became even sharper in the era of quantum mechanics. He's breaking with the past in physics. He's refining and purifying the past in physics. And Einstein's own work comes to be taken up in different contexts by philosopher-physicists all over the world. In a way, different groups tried to make relativity safe for their environment. Arthur Eddington took his natural theology, his Quakerism, and adapted Einstein's work to be part of his way of seeing the world. Vladimir Fock in the Soviet Union worked to reconcile Einstein's theory of absolute space-time, as Fock put it, with Marxism. Einstein's work is constantly in dialogue with philosophy. It's using philosophical criticism to be constructed. It's being used for philosophical purposes once it's produced. The physics is being given philosophical interpretations to fit in with the cultures in which it participates. So you could ask then, is Einstein a positivist? Well, yes. In special relativity, Einstein follows Mach's criticism of absolute space, absolute time, absolute simultaneity. Einstein follows a positivist critique of the ether and says it's a superfluous notion which we don't need. Is Einstein a positivist? Yes. In general relativity, Einstein ascribes physical reality to space-time coincidences only, builds on his 1907 equivalence principle that you can't tell the difference by any experience between being in an accelerated frame and being in a gravitational field. Einstein abhors the idea of absolute rotation. Is Einstein a positivist? No. Even in special relativity, he has no restriction of time to the scale of clocks. You can't say to Einstein, how could relativity apply to the scale of atoms and molecules, because we don't have clocks down there, at least not of the clocks that you find coordinated in a Bern train station. That never troubled Einstein for a single millisecond. Is Einstein a positivist? No. Later in general relativity, Einstein vests the curvature of space-time itself with reality, not restricting himself to concepts or ideas immediately tied to observation. Does Einstein's philosophy change? Well, it's not that Einstein goes from being an anti-realist positivist to being a realist. Einstein always had realistic elements to his philosophy, but he used positivism in a much more active, critical form in his early years. He goes from the simple equations of his first paper in special relativity, which really are not much more complex than a plus b over 2, through the calculus, through differential geometry, to some of the most interesting and exploratory aspects of mathematical physics that you can have, to aspects of mathematical physics that find resonance even today in string theory. Einstein moves his sense of reality gradually away from a strict adherence to clocks and rulers and atoms and molecules towards the fabric of space-time itself, eventually to a hybrid mathematical structure that would, he hoped, unify the forces of nature in all their complexity. In sum, philosophy comes into Einstein's work without epistemology, without real thought about metaphysics, about the nature of philosophy. Einstein thought there could be no real and deep and lasting transformation of physics. But philosophy also comes out. Without relativity, the full-blown logical positivism could never have flourished as it did. Without the idea that you could criticize absolute space, absolute time, the ether, absolute simultaneity, and replace them with constructed perceptual entities, logical positivism couldn't have gotten off the ground. Their idea that logic and experience could combine to build up the world around us took as their best and most lasting example Einstein's critique of absolute space and time.